Hello and welcome to another episode of the Public Affairs in Practice podcast. I've been blown away by the reaction to some of the interviews that I've had in recent weeks and months. So that means I'm even more thrilled today to welcome Robert Magyar to the podcast. Robert and I first got to know each other because he very kindly did a chapter for my book, Public Affairs Global Perspective, now a few years ago. But Robert wrote about engagement and lobbying and public affairs in China, which is not something I had any particular exposure to at all. And rather than trying to make stuff up, I thought I'll speak to an absolute expert. So that's why I thought today to hear from his perspective would be particularly fabulous for the podcast. So look, just to give Robert a bit of an intro, he's worked for it's more than 20 years, and Robert, yours is probably the same as mine. I always forget to update the number of years, so it's probably even more than that now. But over 20 years of global experience, China to Indonesia, Japan, Mexico, and beyond. And as an advisor to senior executives and industry leaders, he's worked across public affairs, government relations, healthcare, consumer, a whole range of work, media, crisis work. But in particular, it's always had a bit of an emphasis on trade issues and sustainability and labour as well. Having run his own consultancy, he now finds himself back at Weber Shandwick, where he spent some time earlier in his career as well. So probably quite interesting to listen about the differences between working for yourself and working for a sort of larger global corporate as well. So Robert, sorry, apologies, long-winded, but I think it's a really, very useful summary because you've done so much. And so first of all, look, how did you get into public affairs, and was it something that you always wanted to do?
Yes, thank you, Stuart. Thank you very much, first of all, for the very kind introduction. Yes, it sounds like I have done a lot, but from my point of view, it feels like, I have been pretty much doing the same thing, although at different places, in the past 20 years. But yes, I mean, my interest in public affairs basically comes from just a very mundane interest of how societies work. And I always had, an interest in that, and even more in, how societies can be organized better and work better. And so after my graduate studies at Georgetown University, I decided that I really want to be in a place where I can, learn about society more and figure out how to make it better. And I thought I would really want to be a political consultant. Now, because I worked and studied in Japan before, I returned to Japan with that idea, and I quickly realized that that's an area where, it's mostly former government officials who come out of government and they do political consulting in very narrow areas. That's kind of the job that they do. And I really wanted to do more. I wanted to kind of be in a broader setting where I can do, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, not kind of be stuck in one specific industry area or sector. And I realized that Weber Shandwick at the time in Tokyo, they had a very strong public affairs and government relations practice. And I was lucky enough to be hired by the then CEO, Takeo Nishitani. And that was the start.
So fascinating. And how long were you at Weber the first time? It was about 6-7 years, something like that?
Yes, that's right. So I joined Weber in Tokyo in 2003, and I was with them until the end of 2010. And 2011, I started Northhead together with my longtime business partner, John Russell. We worked together at Weber, and we decided that, we wanted to focus more on this niche area of public affairs and policy related work. I mean, it's still strategic communications, right? But we really wanted to be in that field where, our knowledge of how the government works in China and across the Asia Pacific can help our clients. And so we started very small, 5 people, and then we grew fairly fast. And by the time, we were acquired in 2021, we had a team of over 30 people in Beijing and doing work across the region. So that was kind of a 13, 14 year period. And then I returned to Weber in the middle of last year, 2024. And now I am in Beijing. My seat is in Beijing, but I look after the Asia Pacific healthcare practice. And within that, of course, we do a lot of PR. We also do public affairs and policy related work, and kind of that's how I returned to Weber.
So when you were originally starting your own business and that sort of, I'm just going to say pivot, probably wasn't a pivot to move from Japan to China or focus on China. Was that because you saw that market opportunity there? And because there are so few people that do, I mean, you'll know, I mean, obviously you tell me different if I'm wrong, but it always seems that there are so few people that really know and understand how the Chinese system and party really work. And therefore so few people that do sort of public affairs, engagement work, in there. How did you end up being one of those few, I guess?
Well, with hindsight, it all looks very strategic, right? I moved from Japan to China. The time is right. China is growing, more attention, and so on and so forth. In reality, being a young consultant in my 30s, really what I wanted to do is just, have a little bit more fun and kind of be in a place where, there is more dynamism, right? I worked in Japan and I lived in Japan for over 10 years. I also did my undergraduate studies there. So I was a little bit restless and I wanted to discover something new. And John Russell, who I mentioned before, and we became business partners, he was also with Weber, looking after the corporate practice across the region. And I really wanted to work with him more than anything else. So when I moved from Tokyo to Beijing in 2009, that was the main reason. And we worked together in Beijing. Honestly, I knew very little of China at the time. But, you have to start somewhere, right? So I have started, I worked with him. We did a lot of projects, involving the government. And, this is kind of the start of my experience in China. But I came here without much knowledge. And I always say maybe that's a good thing because I also had, I didn't have kind of false expectations. And I learned while being here. And I think that was very helpful.
So if you explain to me as a sort of not quite a lay person, but certainly the Chinese system, a lay person, if somebody comes along to you and says, look, we've got this particular, we want to enter the Chinese market, for instance, something along those lines, how would you go about building a sort of a public affairs program or a program that, maybe it's not public affairs, maybe it's slightly different to the way that I think about it. What would that look like?
I actually think, Stuart, that, the Chinese system, of course, for all the cultural differences, is fairly similar to what you see in other markets. I mean, you work on public affairs, everybody who does this work, you have basically three big areas that you have to understand and also advise your clients about, right? Number one, what are the issues, right? So if your client has an issue in China, we start looking at it, what are kind of the policy and regulatory areas that you should know more about? What are the kind of the tangential areas that also affect the area of your business? Make sure that you do the issue mapping very thoroughly. That's number one. I mean, the Chinese system, of course, is complicated by the fact that there is a central government and then 32 provincial governments. And then often, regulations are actually further defined at the local level. But I mean, you have similar systems in some other countries too, right? So number one, issue mapping. Number two, stakeholder mapping. Again, very practical, very normal in our business. You have to figure out what are the agencies that work, in this field, who are the people, whether government or outside government, to push these areas, and then figuring out, who advise these people, right? So stakeholder mapping exercise. Number three, you have to figure out what are the channels, the platforms where you can actually reach these people, where you can, have your messages kind of pushed out. And we do this exercise. And of course, when you do it, a lot of times, I mean, you have that understanding, you have the understanding of the environment, and you can advise clients even on areas where you are not, you don't have that much detailed information, but you know the process. The other thing I will say is that I know that from the outside, China often looks like a black box, but in reality, the government is fairly transparent, very organized. I would say 90% of government officials are experts and technocrats, which is great because, if you bring information to them, they will always be interested, in international data and new ways to produce things. They are always open to have conversations. Now, when you think about, of course, high-level officials, there has been a trend where, very high-level government people don't necessarily talk to companies anymore, or not one-on-one anyway. But then you use the same tools as you use in other markets. You go to industry organizations, associations, professional groups who can carry the messaging and, who are more kind of have more access to these levels of the government. So again, from my point of view, the process and the work is very similar to other markets. But of course, there is a lot of information that you have to absorb. The government structure is a little bit different than in other places. You have to understand the role of the party here and, what kind of information they are looking for or could be sensitive. So that's how we start thinking about, if a client come to us and they have a problem, that's how we start thinking about their issues.
And do you find you have to educate clients, as well as part of that? I mean, I not at the same level, but when I think about if I'm working with US clients and bringing them to the UK, even that can be enough of a difference, and there are more similarities than differences. Do you find that client education piece is something you have to do as well?
Yeah, it is super important. I think, the big companies, they always try to have, internal experts who are fairly familiar with the Chinese environment. But it's not always the case, even for the biggest companies. And another issue that we often face and in our profession, that in-house people tend to be under-resourced. So, in a big country like China, for example, even just following all the information, all the new policies, all the new government actions around you can be quite taxing. Again, if you are looking at, for example, doing business in a number of provinces, you have to follow information from all of those provinces, plus the central government. So yes, we have to educate our clients about the government structure, about, what are the ways you can engage with them. Also, China, again, being a very popular country among, foreign businesses, government officials and stakeholders, they have a very full schedule normally meeting, different people. I don't know if you followed the China Development Forum just last weekend, which is, of course, a huge platform for foreign businesses to meet with Chinese government officials. They had, several dozen global CEOs here in Beijing meeting the government. So it's very difficult to carve out, time for one company. And that education takes time. The second thing I will say about that even when you have, public affairs or government relations officials in your Chinese business, often, of course, these are Chinese people because that makes the most sense. But converting and relaying the information that they gather to headquarters is often an issue because, they don't necessarily have the same sensitivities in China that you would have in the US or Europe. So the information that is relayed is correct, but the nuances and the details are not necessarily what headquarters wants to see to understand the situation on the ground. So, having that bridge function is often, that function is often played by public affairs consultants, agencies, these consultancies, because you can convert the information from China into something that our Western colleagues understand more easily.
And do you have or is there a particular type of client that comes to you, Robert, in beforehand and at Weber or anything along those lines? Is it sort of, I don't know, big international businesses that want to engage with China, or is it actually maybe even other aspects of Chinese businesses or other businesses around Asia that want to come into China potentially?
With regards to China, most of my work nowadays is healthcare related, and I will say, 90% of pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies and, life sciences companies, they are already in China. So they have a good understanding of what's happening around them. And often what we do is, as I mentioned earlier, is helping them because they have internal resource issues. They don't necessarily have enough people to do things. So, that definitely happens. Talking about the bridge function, I will also say there are different types of engagement. If the engagement comes from the headquarters of a multinational company, then of course, what you provide as information is at a different level, different detail than if the request comes from the China side of the company, right? The China business of a multinational company, where, people have a much better understanding of the environment and they might just need, help with the kind of constant monitoring and so on. Now, the third type of businesses, of course, is people who are interested in China, but they don't necessarily have permanent representation, in the country. And then I think the role of a consultant in a public affairs agency is much larger. You can really help them to shape their strategy. You can really advise them, how much they should invest into, their business and engagement within China. So that happens sometimes. There are, for example, professional groups and industry associations whose members are already in China, but the umbrella organization doesn't have representatives in China. They just come here every now and again and, then support on these visits, and providing them with information becomes the main job.
No, just sort of related to that, Robert. So is it better for businesses to have a presence in China, or maybe it's even required that they have a presence in China, or has that shifted over the years as the nature of economic development in China has changed as well?
This is a very interesting question, and I think most of the discussions about doing business in China are focusing on your revenue, your profit margin, and so on and so forth, which are, of course, very important if you are a business. And just yesterday, I was meeting with some of my colleagues and friends who work in, similar positions, and we were discussing that the misunderstanding is that, it is a fact that China has become a market where, profit margins are getting smaller. There is more complexity. There are structural issues within China that need to be resolved, and companies look at that as maybe a hindrance in their business. So, it has become a more complex environment. At the same time, if your main issue is that there is more competition and there is a more complex environment, I think that's not a reason to not to be in China. And I will even turn this around and say, by being in China and being in this very competitive environment, you can set yourself up for success outside China, because you can hone your strategies and you can hone your products and your business instincts to a level where, you would be more successful in a less competitive market, in Southeast Asia or, Latin America, or even in Europe or the States, because, it gives you an edge by being able to compete in this very competitive and complex environment. That is my view, but, I tend to be kind of a glass full or half full type of person. For many companies, they just see the problems and the difficulties and they think, this is not beneficial to them. But I think learning and being in a competitive environment can be very beneficial to companies.
I think that's a very fair point. And also it's sort of, the idea that, elsewhere in the world, that there is some sort of perfect market that that
Oh,
isn't
yeah.
complex or doesn't have different regulatory issues or anything along those sort of lines. But particularly for the size of the market as well, I think would be sort of slightly naive as
Yes.
well, wouldn't it? I mean, there aren't many countries that you can sort of simply swoop in, make loads of cash, and repatriate it to wherever you're based. Quite rightly, I think as well. But anyway, that's by its very nature, any engagement with government, but business is complicated and
Yes.
prone to change, and governments want to make changes because of electoral reasons or community reasons, and they make mistakes. That's just that's a pretty universal thing as far as I can say, depending on regardless of whatever system you're in,
Yes.
it's mistakes because people don't do the engagement part.
I agree. And there is one other aspect that I think is very important in China. The government, in terms of their priorities and what they think are important, policies and trends in the world and within the Chinese economy, they are very, very clear about their position. So, if you're a smart person and you look at what are the priorities of the government, you can actually manage your business in such a way so that you answer to those priorities, right? I mean, the one thing that we always kind of tell clients, when they come to us, if you are in another market, in another country, and you figure out what your priorities are as a business, you can go to the government and say, listen, this is what I think is important, how can we work together? Now, that never works in China. In China, you have to look at what are the priorities of the government and then figure out how you can link to that. So I think that's an important difference in kind of the angle you are looking at your business, right? You always have to look at from the angle of the government priority. But as I said, those priorities are very clear. The objectives are very clear. And if you can support those as a company and work towards them, China is a fairly manageable environment, I think. If there is obviously more domestic competition now, Chinese companies are becoming stronger, and I think that's a good thing. But yeah, I think if you look at what the government feels is a priority, you can put together a business plan in a fairly straightforward way.
No, I think that's a very good point, and that piece around government drive decision making and ethos, I guess, as well. Within that, that's a really interesting point. Now, just sort of moving away from China, on a personal level, you've shifted. Say, we've talked about how you had your own business and now back into Weber again. How have you found that transition? Because it must be fascinating, because you're with your business partner for quite a while, and I'm sure Weber's a lovely place to work, but you must find it a bit different not being your own boss.
Well, definitely. It is very different. I left Weber at the end of 2010, and it was because we had, a great idea and a great opportunity together with John, and I really, felt that it was an interesting kind of, direction that we wanted to do. I always liked to work in Weber, so it was not because I didn't like the place. I find Weber a very collegial company. People talk to each other and help each other, and I like that. And I must say, the company hasn't changed much in that sense. When we started the company, North Head, I remember I read an economist article that said, every second business basically fails. So the chance of succeeding is about 50%. I said, well, all right, let's try, maybe we can do better than that. And we were successful. And then another article I remember from The Economist says, when you are acquired or through acquisitions, management changes about 50-60% of the time. So I was basically ready for, looking at some new opportunities. I mean, I think, after 13 years running your own company, it's natural that people think about, all right, what are some other options, looking around a bit. And Weber at the time was looking, and I felt, this is a company where I had a very good time, and I know their business very well. So it was somewhat natural to, talk to them again and returning. Now, the other point on this, of course, is, when you run your own company, and we went from 5 to 30 people, as I mentioned before, that's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of hard work managing and growing and making sure that, you have the right cash flow at all times. And so I think I was a little bit tired of that level of, kind of very detailed management involvement. And the resources are, of course, also smaller. I mean, Weber, as you know, it's one of the largest PR firms in the world with a lot of resources and a lot of senior expert people. And I felt that I really wanted to learn more. And when you run your company, of course, you learn from your clients and you learn from your employees. But I wanted to have the chance again to learn from some very senior experts. I have been very lucky in my, professional life. I had some great mentors, as Takeo Nishitani I mentioned before, and Hitoshi Shioya, who were running Weber at the time I was in Japan, and also working with John Russell. I learned most of, what I know today from him. But I felt that, there are other people around the world, and definitely within Weber, who I see as very good professionals and mentors I can learn from. So that's another reason why I felt this is the time, I think maybe the last time in my life, where I proactively feel that I want to learn more. So it was time for that.
Oh, that's a really important point you raise, and I think very often we tend to think of that learning process as taking place when we start in a career, and you mentioned some of the colleagues there that you got good advice from, but then somehow you get past the age of, I don't know, insert number, 35, 40, whatever, and then you sort of know everything you need to know. So I can absolutely understand why you've sort of taken that decision, or that's part of the decision-making process. I too have found that as well. You're in one environment and you are the sort of the person that people look up to constantly, but actually being part of a different sort of team. I'm doing some freelance work at the moment, and I'm fortunate to be part of that sort of team where you can look around and you can learn from others still and get a different perspective, or something about, I don't know, anything from internal comms to corporate, internal relations, or anything along those sort of lines. You think, actually, no, I have just learned something from that. And to have that sort of supportive and its team structure, whatever we want to think of it as, I think should be there right the way throughout a career, if at all possible. So, I would fully endorse that, Robert, entirely.
That is just so true. I mean, when you are the most senior person in an organization, I think it's very difficult to kind of be learning. I mean, I see my role, and I've always seen my role as a senior manager as basically supporting, my teams. I really think that, when you are the boss or managing people, your role is to support them. It's not the other way around. And, that limits the time for you to learn new things. But I feel I want to learn more. I mean, as I mentioned, healthcare is really an area that I have been very passionate about. And now in this new environment, in Weber, I also started learning more about sustainability. I started learning more about, as you mentioned, internal and employee communications. And these are all areas that are very, very important today.
Yeah, particularly in public affairs. I mean, we've changed over the years and we've morphed, and, less about the politics, arguably, and more about these other aspects. And that often means, working with others to deliver that. Still trying to get the influence and the public policy change and that we're trying to seek, but using those different elements of communication to try and do that. And you mentioned that, several names of people that you've worked with and have influenced you. Have you had any particularly sort of good pieces of advice or particular direction that they've pushed you in that time as well?
Well, I think really the example of, just hard work is the example really that I learned from most of these people that I look up to. And from the very beginning, I felt that that's such a important point. I think for your employees and also clients to respect you, you have to show that you really know everything, or as much as possible you can, about the topics and stakeholders around you, right? So the other thing that, one of my mentors told me when I started kind of, coming up the ladder and the hierarchy and started managing people was a very important point. And I will always remember that. He said, listen, if you want to be in management, you must understand that 99% of the time you are dealing with problems. There are no good days. There are bad days. There are less bad days. But, you are dealing with people. You are dealing with managing a company. Normally, this is about resolving issues and problems. And I find that, mostly true. I would say there are more good days than I would have imagined, 20 years ago or 15 years ago. And I think as you get more senior and you get more relaxed, of course, in the various roles, it's easier to have good days. But, I see myself as someone who helps clients to resolve their problems, who helps my team members to resolve their problems. So that's the position to be in. And I will always remember that sentence from my manager.
I think that's very wise, frankly. Slightly depressing, but very wise. And as you think about your role and as it's changed again, now you're sort of back into Weber. How do you see your role changing, or even public affairs in not just China but across the region as well? What are your thoughts there?
Yes, so I came back to Weber basically because I really see the opportunities in the field that I'm working in, and as I mentioned, I felt like with the right resources, there is really a lot of business and a lot of opportunities that a company like Weber can go after. So my role is to actually build a strong healthcare public affairs team, which I have started already, and we are in about a dozen markets throughout Asia Pacific. So obviously, that means that, having people who understand all of those markets is very important, and it takes some time to get there. But I already have understanding, of a few. As you mentioned, I worked in Indonesia, in Philippines, in Vietnam. I have experience that I can rely on. But, these type of projects cannot be done by one person. So really my main goal in the next few years is to build the best healthcare public affairs team in Asia. And fortunately, it looks like I have the support of our management. So I think we will get there.
Well, look, that sounds fantastic. No small task. But that's and I wish you every good fortune in succeeding in that endeavor, Robert. So look, thank you very much for your time today. It's hugely appreciated. I know people listening will I think gained a lot of insight from our discussion. So look, thank you very much. And maybe if I ever go to China or Far East, I'll knock on your door and try and learn even more.
I would welcome you visiting here very much. So please let me know if you do that. And thank you for today's discussion. I really enjoyed it, Stuart.
Thank you.